3 months earlier, Napoleon Bonaparte stepped off a boat onto French sand with 1,000 men, and a gambler's faith that France still remembered his name. The Bourbon king had given the people peace, but peace tastes bitter when it comes wrapped in foreign bayonets and the shame of occupation. Within 20 days, peasants threw flowers at imperial eagles, veterans left their plows to follow the tricolor, and King Louis fled Paris like a thief in the night. But this was not the Napoleon who had shattered Austria at Austerlitz or crushed Prussia at Jena. This emperor carried 20 years of war in his bones, and the Grande Armée that answered his call bore little resemblance to the machine that once terrorized Europe. Where Moscow had claimed 500,000 men, where Leipzig had bled away another 100,000, now conscripts barely old enough to shave stood beside graying veterans whose scars told stories of a dozen campaigns. The legend speaks of France rising as one man to welcome their emperor home. The truth walks on blistered feet and sleeps in rain-soaked camps. Napoleon could summon an army, but he could not summon time. The coalition powers had spent a year rebuilding their strength, while exile rotted his forces on Elba. Britain's gold flowed like water to arm Austria, Prussia, and Russia. Wellington commanded seasoned troops who had learned their trade in Spain's brutal mountains. Blücher's Prussians marched with the memory of Leipzig burning in their hearts. Yet Napoleon still possessed the one weapon that had carried him from Corsican obscurity to master of Europe. His mind could see patterns where others saw chaos, could find the weak point in any line, could turn an enemy's strength into their destruction. At Ligny, just 2 days before, he had bloodied Blücher's nose and sent the Prussians reeling eastward. At Quatre Bras, Ney had held Wellington in place while the emperor struck his divided enemies in detail. Now the pieces converged on this Belgian ridge where a road to Brussels ran straight through Wellington's line. One more victory would scatter the coalition, bring Austria and Russia to the negotiating table, and prove that eagles still flew higher than lions. Napoleon believed he faced only Wellington's mixed force of 70,000, believed Blücher's army was retreating toward Germany, and believed he could smash the British before any help arrived. But belief and reality were about to collide with the sound of cannon, and the morning mist that clung to Mont Saint-Jean carried more than moisture. It carried the approaching thunder of Prussian boots. While Napoleon dreamed of one last triumph, Europe's crowned heads opened their treasuries and called their armies home. The Congress of Vienna had barely finished carving up the continent when news arrived that the Corsican had escaped his island cage. Within weeks, gold flowed from London's banks to every capital that nursed grudges against France. Austria mobilized 200,000 men along the Rhine. Russia promised another 150,000 would march west before summer's end. But the coalition could not wait for such overwhelming numbers to gather. The arithmetic was brutal and simple. Napoleon commanded perhaps 200,000 troops across all fronts, but he could concentrate only 72,000 for this northern campaign against Belgium. Against him, Britain's Duke of Wellington assembled a polyglot army of 68,000 that included not just British redcoats, but Dutch, Belgian, Hanoverian, and Brunswick troops, whose loyalty remained questionable. More dangerous still, Field Marshal Blücher's Prussians brought another 70,000 veterans who remembered the humiliation of Jena and the fires that had consumed Berlin. Wellington understood his weakness. Half his army consisted of foreign troops who might break at the first cannon blast, and many of his British regiments were green recruits who had never heard shot fired in anger. The Iron Duke chose his ground with the cold precision of a surgeon selecting where to cut. The ridge at Mont Saint-Jean offered a reverse slope where his infantry could shelter from artillery, stone farmhouses that could anchor his flanks, and roads that led straight back to Brussels if retreat became necessary. But Wellington's true genius lay not in the ground he chose to defend, but in the message he sent racing east to find Blücher. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Wellington would hold the ridge and absorb Napoleon's assault until the Prussians arrived to strike the French right flank. If the timing worked, Napoleon's army would be crushed between hammer and anvil. If it failed, both Allied armies would be destroyed in detail, just as Napoleon had planned. Blücher's Prussians had taken a beating at Ligny 2 days before. But the old marshal possessed something more valuable than fresh troops. He possessed hatred. For 7 years, Prussian mothers had told their children stories about French soldiers kicking down doors in the night. Prussian farmers had watched their harvests disappear into French supply wagons. Prussian nobles had bowed to French governors and swallowed their pride like poison. Now Blücher promised his men something sweeter than victory. He promised them revenge. The Prussians would march toward the sound of Wellington's guns, and if they had to crawl through their own blood to reach the battlefield, they would arrive in time to settle accounts with Bonaparte. Yet numbers alone would not win this battle. Napoleon had beaten larger armies before by moving faster than his enemies could think, by striking where they were weakest, by turning their strength against them. The emperor still commanded the most experienced officers in Europe, artillery crews who could load and fire faster than any gunners alive, and cavalry that had charged across every battlefield from Madrid to Moscow. But for the first time in 20 years of war, Napoleon faced enemies who had learned from their defeats. Wellington had studied every French victory, understood how Napoleon split enemy armies and crushed them separately. The Duke would not give the Emperor that chance. His message to Blücher carried more than tactical coordination. It carried a promise that this time, the coalition would stand together or fall together. The stage was set, the actors in place, and dawn approached with the weight of the empire hanging in the balance. Dawn breaks gray and heavy over the Belgian countryside on June 18th, and the sky weeps rain that turns roads into rivers of mud. Napoleon Bonaparte stands in the farmhouse at Le Caillou, staring through windows streaked with water at a battlefield he cannot see. The emperor, who has won campaigns by striking at first light, now faces an enemy more dangerous than Wellington's guns. Time itself has turned against him. The rain had fallen through the night, drumming on tent canvas and soaking into earth that would soon drink blood. French artillery wheels sink hub-deep into mire that grips like quicksand. Cavalry horses struggle through mud that pulls at their hooves with every step. Infantry march in columns that stretch and compress as men slip and stumble on roads that have become traps. But Napoleon believes the delay cost Wellington more than it cost France. Every hour the emperor waits is another hour for Blücher's battered Prussians to limp further from the battlefield. The marshal had taken a beating at Ligny, lost nearly 20,000 men, and surely his broken army was retreating toward Germany. Napoleon's spies reported Prussian columns moving east, away from Waterloo, away from any chance to rescue Wellington. The emperor could afford to wait for the ground to dry. His artillery needed firm footing to unlimber and fire. His cavalry required solid earth to charge with devastating effect. A few hours of sunshine would turn the sodden fields into the killing ground, where French guns would shatter Wellington's army before any help could arrive. Yet 60 miles away, Marshal Blücher was not retreating. The 73-year-old Prussian commander lay in agony, his ribs cracked from a horse that had fallen on him at Ligny, his body reeking of gin and garlic from his doctor's remedies. But his mind burned with clarity sharper than pain. The retreat his scouts reported was an illusion, a redeployment that would concentrate his surviving forces at Wavre, while advance guards moved toward Wellington's guns. Blücher understood what Napoleon refused to see. This was not a battle for Belgium or even for Europe. This was the last chance to cage the eagle forever. The Prussian marshal had sworn an oath that he would march toward Wellington's aid, and Prussian honor did not bend for mud or rain or broken bones. As morning stretched toward noon, Napoleon finally mounted his horse and rode forward to study Wellington's position. The Allied line stretched along the ridge like a serpent, basking in weak sunlight that had begun to pierce the clouds. British redcoats stood in squares behind the crest, and the stone walls of Hougoumont farmhouse commanded the western approach. The emperor saw what he expected to see. Wellington's mixed army looked solid but brittle, the kind of force that would shatter if struck hard at the right point. Napoleon's plan was simple. A diversionary attack on Hougoumont would draw British reserves west, then his grand battery of 80 guns would pound the Allied center until infantry could march through the gap and split Wellington's line in half. But the clock read past 11, and somewhere beyond the eastern horizon, Prussian boots were already eating up the miles that separated Wavre from Waterloo. The fatal delay had given Blücher exactly what he needed. Not time to retreat, but time to advance. The hammer was moving into position, and Napoleon had no idea that the anvil was about to spring shut. At 11:30, the guns speak their first words of the day. French artillery thunders from the ridge opposite Wellington's line, and smoke begins to drift across the valley like morning fog that refuses to lift. But Napoleon's opening move is not the devastating bombardment that will shatter the Allied center. Instead, he sends his brother Jerome's division stumbling through the mud toward a stone farmhouse that squats on Wellington's right flank, like a medieval fortress. Hougoumont seems an unlikely place for empire to begin its death throes. The complex of buildings surrounds a courtyard barely large enough for a dozen horses, its walls thick enough to stop musket balls, its gates solid oak reinforced with iron bands. Wellington has garrisoned it with 4 companies of Coldstream Guards, men who have learned their trade in Spain's bitter mountains, and know that stone walls can be worth 1,000 bayonets. Jerome Bonaparte commands 8,000 French infantry, enough men to overwhelm any farmhouse garrison by sheer weight of numbers. The prince's orders are simple. Create a diversion that will pull British reserves away from Wellington's center, then withdraw when the real attack begins. But orders written in headquarters tents have a way of changing shape when they meet enemy fire. The first French columns advance through the beechwood that screens Hougoumant's southern approach. Skirmishers dart between trees, their muskets crackling like kindling in a fire, while formed battalions press forward with bayonets gleaming. The guards reply with measured volleys that drop Frenchmen in rows, but still the blue coats come on, driven by trumpets and drums and the promise that glory waits beyond those stone walls. Then the French reach the courtyard, and the diversion becomes a trap. Hougoumant's buildings channel attacking infantry into killing alleys where British muskets can fire from behind cover. The Great Gate stands like a challenge, massive and barred, while loopholes in the walls spit fire at any man foolish enough to show himself. Jerome's battalions surge forward, break against stone that will not yield, and surge forward again. What should have been a 15-minute demonstration stretches into an hour of butchery. French officers drive their men against walls that might as well be built from the bones of their comrades. The farmhouse swallows battalions whole and spits back only screams and smoke. Jerome Bonaparte discovers what his brother refuses to admit, that British infantry behind stone walls cannot be shifted by courage alone. The prince feeds regiment after regiment into the meat grinder, convinced that one more assault will break the garrison's resistance. French engineers drag ladders through the mud, only to watch them splinter under British fire. By afternoon, the diversion has consumed more than half of Jerome's division. Wounded men lie stacked like cordwood in the beechwood, while ammunition wagons race back and forth carrying supplies that disappear into the hungry maw of battle. Still, the French come on, because Jerome's pride will not let him admit that a handful of guardsmen have stopped 8,000 of France's finest soldiers. Wellington watches the slaughter from his ridge and sees exactly what Napoleon intended him to see. British reserves march toward Hougoumont to reinforce the garrison, weakening the Allied center just as the Emperor planned. But the Duke also sees what Napoleon cannot, that the diversion is bleeding France white while barely scratching British strength. The farmhouse that was supposed to be a sideshow becomes the day's first lesson in how the impossible can become inevitable. French valor crashes against British tenacity, and both sides discover that some positions cannot be taken at any price. Hougoumont holds, the French die in heaps, and the real battle has not even begun. At 1 o'clock, Napoleon unleashes hell. 80 cannon wheel into position along the ridge of La Belle Alliance, their bronze barrels glinting in the afternoon sun like the eyes of predators that have caught the scent of blood. This is the Emperor's masterpiece of destruction, a grand battery that stretches nearly half a mile across the battlefield and carries enough firepower to shatter armies. The guns roar as one, and the earth trembles under the weight of their voices. 12-pound cannonballs streak across the valley like messengers of death, smashing into Wellington's ridge with impacts that shake the ground beneath British boots. Smoke billows from the French positions in gray clouds that blot out the sun, while the thunder of artillery drowns out everything except the screams of horses and the crash of splintering wood. Napoleon has positioned his battery with the precision of a clockmaker arranging gears. Heavy guns pound the Allied infantry squares, seeking to break their formations through sheer terror and flying metal. Horse artillery targets Wellington's own cannon, trying to silence the British guns before they can reply. Howitzers lob explosive shells over the ridge, their fuses trailing sparks as they arc through the air to burst among troops who cannot see death coming. But Wellington has chosen his ground with the eye of a man who understands that survival often depends on what the enemy cannot see. The reverse slope of Mont Saint-Jean shelters most of his infantry from direct fire, while his artillery positions itself on the forward slope to duel with Napoleon's guns. British squares lie flat behind the crest, presenting no targets for French gunners who can only guess where their enemies wait. The cannonade builds to a crescendo that can be heard 20 miles away in Brussels, where civilians gather in churches to pray for deliverance from the storm that shakes their windows. Cannonballs skip across the muddy ground like stones on water, each bounce claiming legs and lives before burying themselves in Belgian earth. Grapeshot tears through formations like invisible scythes, leaving gaps that close as surviving soldiers step over their comrades' bodies. Yet for all its sound and fury, the Grand Battery achieves less than Napoleon expects. Wellington's infantry crouches behind the ridge while death flies overhead, emerging only when French columns advance within musket range. British artillery replies with measured precision, each shot carefully aimed at the dense formations of French guns that present perfect targets for counter-battery fire. The French gunners work like demons, ramming charges and shot down smoking barrels that grow too hot to touch, while British guns answer with their own deadly rhythm. Artillery crews duel across the valley with mathematical precision, calculating ranges and angles while round shot screams between the opposing batteries. Men fall in spurts of blood and bone, yet still the guns fire, served by crews who know that victory belongs to whoever can silence the enemy's cannon first. Then Napoleon commits his infantry. 4 divisions of the finest soldiers in Europe march down from the French ridge in columns that stretch like blue rivers across the battlefield. Marshal Ney leads them forward, his sword glinting as he points toward Wellington's battered line. Behind the marching men, drums beat the pas de charge, that hypnotic rhythm that has carried French armies to victory from the pyramids to the gates of Moscow. But the Grand Battery has not broken Wellington's will, only tested it. As French infantry approaches the ridge, British soldiers rise from the earth like ghosts materializing from graves. Redcoats form firing lines too deep, their muskets leveled at the approaching columns with the steady precision of men who have learned to kill without hatred. The collision is about to begin, and the Emperor's artillery has served only to announce that this day will be settled. Not by guns alone, but by the courage of men who must look into each other's eyes before they pull their triggers. The thunder fades, the smoke drifts away, and suddenly the battlefield grows quiet, except for the sound of boots splashing through mud, and the whispered prayers of soldiers who know that death walks beside them with every step. At 1:30, a French cavalry officer rides hard from the eastern woods with news that will crack Napoleon's confidence like a musket ball through glass. Prussian scouts have been spotted moving through the forest of Paris, not retreating toward Germany as the Emperor believed, but advancing toward the sound of Wellington's guns. Marshal Blucher's army is not broken. It is coming, and it carries 45,000 reasons why this battle must end quickly. Napoleon receives the report with the calm of a man who has built an empire on turning disaster into opportunity. So the Prussians approach? Then speed becomes everything. Wellington's ridge must fall before Blucher can intervene, before the hammer and anvil can close around French arms. The Emperor dispatches Count Lobau with 10,000 men to delay the Prussian advance, a rearguard that must buy time with blood. But even as French infantry marches east to face this new threat, Napoleon refuses to believe that Blucher commands more than a broken remnant. The old Prussian marshal had taken a beating at Ligny, lost 20,000 men, and surely could not have reassembled more than 30,000 survivors. Against Wellington's weakening line, such numbers would tip the balance but not guarantee defeat. The Emperor's calculations rest on mathematics that seem sound. If Lobau can hold the Prussians for 3 hours, if D'Erlon's corps can punch through Wellington's center, then French victory remains within reach. But war has a way of making mockeries of mathematics, And time moves differently when measured in heartbeats and musket volleys. Marshal Blücher understands the arithmetic better than Napoleon imagines. The 73-year-old Prussian commander has spent the morning organizing his corps for a march that will decide the fate of Europe. His men stumble through muddy roads with the memory of Leipzig burning in their hearts, driven by officers who promise that today they will settle accounts with the Corsican. Bülow's 4th Corps leads the advance, 25,000 men who have covered 15 miles since dawn despite roads that grab at boots and wagon wheels. Behind them, Perch's 2nd Corps pushes forward with another 20,000 soldiers, while even the battered 3rd Corps sends what men it can spare toward the sound of battle. The first Prussian guns appear on the heights of Saint-Lambert at 2 o'clock, still miles from Wellington's Ridge but close enough to announce their presence with ranging shots that echo across the Belgian countryside. French outposts report columns of blue uniforms emerging from the forest, like a tide that threatens to drown Napoleon's right flank. Now, the Emperor faces the nightmare that has haunted every great captain since Alexander. He must fight on 2 fronts, dividing his attention between Wellington's stubborn defense and Blücher's approaching avalanche. Time, that most precious commodity in war, slips through French fingers like water through a broken cup. Napoleon still believes he can win this race against the clock. His grand battery continues to pound Wellington's Ridge while d'Erlon's corps prepares for the assault that will split the Allied line in half. If the British break in the next hour, the Prussians will arrive only to witness French victory. If Wellington holds much longer, then 45,000 enemy reinforcements will transform a difficult battle into an impossible one. The race has begun, and Napoleon must reach the finish line before his enemies can close the trap that 20 years of coalition warfare has finally sprung. Victory remains possible, but only if measured in minutes rather than hours. Only if French courage can overcome both British tenacity and Prussian revenge before the sun sets on the field of Waterloo. At 3:30 in the afternoon, Marshal Michael Ney makes the mistake that will haunt French military academies for generations. The bravest of the brave stares across the valley at Wellington's Ridge and sees what looks like retreat. British artillery limbers up and pulls back from the forward slope, while infantry squares appear to waver behind the crest. To Ney's battle-scarred eyes, the enemy line is cracking. What the Marshal cannot see is the truth behind Wellington's movements. The Duke is not retreating but repositioning, pulling his guns back to avoid Napoleon's counter-battery fire while keeping his infantry safe behind the reverse slope. But Ney has spent 20 years reading battlefields, and every instinct screams that this is the moment when bold action can snap victory's thread. Without waiting for orders, without coordinating with infantry support, Ney waves his sword toward the British line and shouts the command that will echo through history. "The day is ours! Follow me!" 4,000 French cavalry surge forward, the flower of Napoleon's mounted arm launching itself across the muddy valley, in a charge that should have waited for the squares to break. Cuirassiers thunder across the battlefield in steel breastplates, sunlight flashing from sabers raised above plumed helmets. Behind them come chasseurs and hussars, their horses' hooves drumming like war drums calling soldiers to glory. The sight is magnificent, a river of horses and steel flowing toward Wellington's Ridge with the power to sweep away armies. But Wellington's infantry is not broken, and British squares do not scatter like wheat before the wind. As French cavalry crest the ridge, they discover the bitter truth that Ney's eyes could not see. Red-coated soldiers stand in perfect squares, their bayonets bristling like hedgehog spines, their muskets loaded with ball and buck that can drop a horse at 50 paces. The first volley crashes out like thunder, and the leading rank of cavalry dissolves in smoke and screaming horses. Cuirassiers tumble from their saddles while their mounts rear in terror. But still, the charge comes on. French horsemen riding over their fallen comrades to strike at British steel, with sabers that spark against bayonet points. Then the squares show their true strength. Infantry warfare has evolved beyond the days when cavalry could scatter foot soldiers with shock alone. Wellington's men pour volley after volley into the swirling mass of horses and riders, each discharge claiming lives while survivors wheel away to gather for another hopeless assault. Ney leads charge after charge up that bloody slope, his uniform torn by musket balls, his horse shot from under him 3 times. The Marshal fights on foot when he must, grabbing the reins of riderless horses to mount again. His courage is beyond question, but courage cannot overcome mathematics, and mathematics says that cavalry alone cannot break disciplined infantry in square. For an hour, French horsemen hurl themselves against British bayonets with the futility of waves against a cliff. They capture some of Wellington's abandoned guns, but without infantry support, they cannot destroy the cannon they have won. British gunners take shelter in the squares, then return to their pieces when cavalry retreats. Napoleon watches from his command post and sees his cavalry reserve bleeding away in useless charges. The emperor should recall Ney, should coordinate the assault with infantry and artillery, should impose the tactical discipline that has won him a dozen battles. But the Prussians grow closer with every minute, and desperation clouds judgment like smoke obscures a battlefield. By 4:30, Ney's great cavalry charge has achieved nothing except to fill Belgian fields with dead horses and brave men who deserved better leadership. The British squares stand unbroken. Wellington's line holds, and somewhere in the eastern woods, Prussian drums beat the advance while French cavalry limps back to lick wounds that will never fully heal. At 6 o'clock, with the sun sinking toward the western horizon and Prussian artillery already thundering against his right flank, Napoleon Bonaparte plays his final card. The Imperial Guard stands ready behind La Belle Alliance, 5 battalions of the finest soldiers who ever carried muskets, men who have marched from Madrid to Moscow and never known defeat. These are the Emperor's immortals, the ones who call him Le Petit Caporal, and would follow him into hell itself if he but pointed the way. The Guard has waited all day in perfect formation while lesser men bled and died for the glory of France. Tall grenadiers in bearskin caps stand shoulder to shoulder with chasseurs whose mustaches are gray with powder smoke from a dozen campaigns. Their uniforms bear the scars of Austerlitz and Jena, Wagram, and Borodino. Each man carries 60 rounds of ammunition, a bayonet sharp enough to shave with, and the absolute certainty that where the Guard advances, victory follows. But this is not the Guard that conquered Europe. Age and attrition have thinned their ranks, replacing veterans with conscripts who wear the sacred uniform without earning it through years of blood. Many of the old sergeants who held the line at Eylau lie buried in Russian snow, while the corporals who charge the guns at Wagram sleep beneath Spanish olive trees. Still, the mystique remains, the legend that makes enemy armies tremble when they hear the drums beat La Grenadière. Napoleon himself rides forward to address them, his gray coat dusty from a day of battle, his face carved with lines that tell the story of 20 years of war. The Emperor speaks in the voice that has rallied armies from the edge of defeat, promising these men that one more victory will crown their sacrifices, that England's gold and Prussia's hatred will shatter against French steel and French hearts. The Guard begins its march at 6:15, 5 columns moving with the mechanical precision of clockwork soldiers. Drums beat the pas de charge while fifes shriek their battle song, and 20,000 French throats roar "Vive l'Empereur!" until the sound echoes off the walls of Brussels 20 miles away. This is how empires make their last stand, with music and courage and the absolute faith that will can overcome mathematics. Up the slope they march, through smoke that clings to the ground like fog, past the wreckage of Ney's cavalry charges and the corpses of d'Erlon's infantry. The Guard steps over French bodies without breaking stride, their ranks as straight as if they were parading before the Tuileries Palace. Behind them, Napoleon watches through his telescope and sees his destiny walking toward the British guns. Wellington's line wavers as the Guard approaches. Allied soldiers who have held their ground all day suddenly face the legendary troops whose reputation alone has won battles. Dutch and Belgian regiments begin to drift backward, their officers shouting commands that are lost in the thunder of approaching boots. Even British veterans feel their pulse quicken as the bearskin caps emerge from the smoke like the headgear of ancient gods. Then the British reply with the discipline that has made them masters of half the world. The first foot guards rise from behind the ridge crest where they have waited in perfect silence, their redcoats forming a wall that stretches across the Guards' advance. At 50 paces, they deliver the volley that legends die upon, a crushing discharge that drops the leading rank of French grenadiers like wheat before the scythe. The Imperial Guard staggers but does not break. These are men who have charged through Russian blizzards and Spanish heat, who have seen their emperor crown himself and watched kings bow before French eagles. They reload with the mechanical efficiency of 20 years' practice, return the British volley, and press forward over the bodies of their fallen comrades. But the magic is gone. The Guard discovers what no French soldier has ever learned before, that they are mortal, that their uniforms do not stop British bullets, that courage alone cannot overcome superior position and concentrated firepower. For the first time in their history, the Imperial Guard begins to fall back, their ranks broken, their mystique shattered on the Belgian ridge. The cry goes up from Allied throats in a dozen languages. La Garde recule. The Guard retreats. The words spread like wildfire through Napoleon's army, carrying with them the death of hope. If the Guard can be beaten, if the Emperor's immortals can bleed and die like ordinary men, then France itself can fall. The retreat becomes a rout, 20 years of victory collapsing in 20 minutes of Belgian mud. Napoleon watches his empire die with the stoicism of a man who has always known that fortune's wheel never stops turning. The Guard limps back down the slope, their bearskin caps scattered like autumn leaves, their legend buried in the same grave that holds French dreams of European mastery. The sun sets on Waterloo, and with it sets the star that rose over a young artillery officer in Corsica and blazed across the continent until this moment when mathematics finally conquered will. The retreat of the Imperial Guard breaks more than French formations. It breaks the spell that has held Napoleon's empire together for 20 years, the belief that the Emperor is destiny's chosen instrument and that French arms are invincible. Panic spreads through the ranks like wildfire through dry wheat, carrying with it the collapse of everything Bonaparte has built since his guns first spoke at the bridge of Lodi. Sauve qui peut! The cry echoes across the battlefield as French discipline dissolves into chaos. Every man for himself. Soldiers who have marched in perfect step from Spain to Russia suddenly remember that they are mortals who bleed and die, not instruments of imperial will. They throw down their muskets and run toward the Brussels road, their retreat becoming a stampede that tramples the wounded and abandons the guns. Wellington sees the moment and seizes it with the instinct that has made him master of every battlefield from India to Iberia. The Duke raises his hat above his head, waves it toward the fleeing French, and gives the order that ends empires. The whole line will advance. 70,000 Allied soldiers rise from behind the ridge like a red tide flowing downhill, their bayonets glinting in the evening sun as they sweep across the valley. Behind the advancing British comes something more terrible than defeat. The Prussians arrive at last, Blücher's battered but unbroken army striking Napoleon's right flank with the fury of 7 years' accumulated hatred. Zieten's corps smashes into French positions that are already crumbling, while Bülow's infantry rolls up the line like a carpet being pulled from under a falling man's feet. Napoleon tries to rally his men one final time, riding among the fleeing columns with his sword drawn, shouting orders that are lost in the thunder of retreat. For a moment, some of the old guard forms square around their emperor, determined to die rather than see him captured by enemies who have sworn to cage the eagle forever. But even these most faithful cannot hold back the flood of defeat that carries everything before it. The emperor's carriage waits behind La Belle Alliance, loaded with gold and maps and the imperial seal that has commanded Europe. Napoleon climbs inside with the movements of a man who has aged 20 years in 20 minutes, his face gray with dust and the knowledge that everything he has fought for lies broken on this Belgian field. The carriage wheels turn, carrying Bonaparte toward exile and a lonely rock in the South Atlantic. French generals who pledged their lives to the imperial cause suddenly discover urgent business elsewhere. Marshal Soult races toward Paris with dispatches that transform defeat into strategic withdrawal. General Grouchy continues to chase phantom Prussians while the real army bleeds to death behind him. Only Ney remains on the field, fighting like a man possessed until his horse is shot, and he must retreat on foot, his uniform torn, his dreams shattered. By 9 o'clock, Waterloo belongs to the victors. Wellington and Blücher meet at La Belle Alliance, the inn that had sheltered Napoleon's headquarters just hours before. The two old soldiers shake hands in the twilight, their faces grim with the knowledge that they have witnessed the end of an age. 22 years of nearly constant warfare have finally concluded, not with negotiation or compromise, but with the mathematical certainty of superior numbers applied with ruthless precision. The battlefield tells the story in language written with blood and bone. 40,000 men lie dead or wounded in an area smaller than Hyde Park, their bodies testament to the price of empire and the cost of one man's ambition. French eagles that have flown from Madrid to Moscow now rest in Allied hands, their glory tarnished, but their legends secure. This was how Napoleon's 72,000 faced 118,000 allies and learned that even genius has limits, that even the greatest military mind in history cannot overcome impossible odds forever. The final battle that changed the world proved that mathematics, not miracles, decides the fate of nations, and that every empire, no matter how glorious, eventually discovers the boundaries that destiny has drawn around it. Napoleon Bonaparte abdicated for the second time on June 22, 1815, 4 days after Waterloo shattered his dreams of restored empire. The man who crowned himself emperor in Notre Dame now signs away his throne in a country house near Paris, his signature, transforming him from ruler of Europe to prisoner of British naval power. By October, he stands on the deck of HMS Northumberland, bound for St. Helena, a volcanic rock in the South Atlantic where eagles cannot fly. The Congress of Vienna reconvenes with grim satisfaction, its diplomats now free to carve up Europe without fear that the Corsican will escape again. France loses the territories Napoleon conquered, but keeps its borders largely intact. The Allies understanding that crushing France too harshly will only breed the resentment that feeds future wars. But Waterloo's true legacy extends far beyond redrawn borders and restored monarchs. The battle proves that coalitions can defeat genius if they hold together long enough, that mathematics eventually overcomes individual brilliance, that even the greatest military mind cannot overcome impossible odds forever. The lesson resonates through military academies for generations. Coordination beats individual excellence, logistics decides outcomes, and hubris kills empires. Wellington becomes a hero whose name will echo through British history, his defensive mastery cementing his reputation as the general who never lost a battle. Blücher rides home to Prussia as the old warrior who kept his promise, the man whose stubbornness saved Europe from another round of French domination. Together, they prove that Allied cooperation can achieve what individual nations cannot. The battlefield itself becomes a pilgrimage site almost immediately. Tourists arrive to walk the ridge where British squares held firm, to see Hougoumont where French valor died against British stone, to stand on La Belle Alliance where Wellington and Blücher shook hands over Napoleon's broken dreams. France buries its eagles but not its memory. Veterans return home with stories that transform defeat into legend, tales of how the Guard never truly retreated, how Napoleon was betrayed by incompetent marshals, how one more hour would have changed everything. The myth of the emperor grows stronger in exile than it ever was in power. For 99 years, the great powers of Europe will remember Waterloo and the price of total war. Not until 1914 will the continent again descend into conflict that consumes entire nations, and when it does, generals on both sides will study Napoleon's campaigns and promise themselves they will not repeat his mistakes. Some keep that promise. Most do not. The rain still falls on Belgian fields each June, washing over monuments that mark where empires came to die. A stone lion stands on the mound, built over where the Prince of Orange was wounded, its paw resting on a sphere that represents the world Napoleon could not conquer. The ridge remains weathered but unbroken, a testament to the day when 72,000 faced 118,000 and discovered that some battles cannot be won by genius alone. This is the echo that lasts beyond the battle, beyond the emperor, beyond the age of eagles and empire. Waterloo proved that coordination defeats brilliance, that logistics matter more than tactics, that numbers eventually overcome genius. The world was remade on that ridge, and the shape it took would last until the 20th century brought new weapons and new horrors. If you found this story of impossible odds and their inevitable conclusion compelling, drop a comment about which other legendary last stand you would like to see covered. What battle comes to mind when you think of courage facing mathematics and discovering where destiny draws its final line?